Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. Can the president's statements about Muslims and about Islam, his rhetoric, which many regard as anti-Muslim and anti-Islam, be separated from what may be valid national security concerns about immigrants to this country? That's the subject of a very important Supreme Court case that was decided just a few months ago, and that is the subject of today's episode. My guest, Professor Sahar Aziz, a professor of law and social justice and Middle East studies at the Rutgers University Law School and the founding director of the Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights. We talk about the impact of anti-Muslim rhetoric, Islamophobia growing in prominence since 9/11 and during the campaign for president in 2016, and out of the mouth of this president in ways that we haven't heard in a very long time in this country. What is the impact of this important Supreme Court case? How did the court try to wrestle with these issues? And how as a country do we deal with anti-Islam sentiment today? Professor Aziz and I discuss these and other issues. Stay tuned for a fascinating episode. My guest today on Good Law, Bad Law is Sahar Aziz. She's the professor of law and Chancellor's social justice scholar and Middle East studies director at the Rutgers University Law School in New Jersey. And she's also the founding director of the Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights. So Professor Aziz, Sahar, thank you so much for being on the program today.
Thank you for inviting me.
We're going to tackle such an extremely important subject, and one that touches on so many aspects of what we're dealing with in today's politics and in today's life and social life, from immigration to civil rights to discrimination to politics and just how we live as Americans in this country. Sahar, we're going to talk about, as a jumping off point into the question of how Muslims in America, Muslim Americans are treated, and how our country regards Muslim immigration. We're going to look in some detail at the Supreme Court's decision last summer. I think now really paid very little attention to relative to its importance. The case involving what some call President Trump's Muslim ban, revised for political digestion as the travel ban, and how the Supreme Court handled the issues that were raised in that case. And then we'll jump from there into some broader themes that I know, Sahar, you're exploring not only in your work and your teachings, but also in a book you have coming out next year. So I want to get to all of that. But first, if you wouldn't mind, Sahar, give us a little bit of background into yourself and your path to this whole topic and area of research and study.
Well, thank you so much again for inviting me. In many ways, the work that I do is both personal and professional, and there's a saying in the critical legal studies that the personal is political and the political is personal. And many of us who teach law and teach the next generation of law students fit into that category. So as someone who self-identifies as a Muslim American and an Egyptian American, what happened on September 11th, 2001, the terrorist attacks against the United States by 19 individuals, criminals, hijackers, and murderers who claim to be Muslim and who claim to do this in the name of Islam, first was rejected by those of us who adhere to that faith, but also resulted in the collective punishment of between 6 to 8 million people in the United States who self-identify as Muslims. And it was a paradigm shift in terms of the way that these very diverse communities, diverse racially and ethnically and class-wise as well, is a paradigm shift in the way that they were treated by the government, by their neighbors, by their teachers, by their coworkers, where suddenly they were guilty of this horrendous crime, notwithstanding that they didn't know these individuals and they certainly rejected what had just happened and condemned it. And as a result, for the past 18 years, and the Muslim ban is the latest iteration of this 18 years and going phenomena of what I call post 9/11 discrimination, and also ultimately the racialization of Muslims, is that these communities have been experiencing multiple forms of discrimination. And unfortunately, it isn't simply by fringe actors. It is not simply by radical extremists on the right or on the left, but it has become mainstream primarily because the government has legitimized it. And so these various myriad forms of subordination, a term of art in the critical race theory, prompted me and many others, some of whom belonged to these communities and had family and friends and had even personally been adversely harmed by these anti-Muslim stereotypes, but some who didn't, who had nothing to do with the communities but saw this phenomena, this post 9/11 discrimination phenomena, as a attack or an affront on American values of racial equality, religious freedom, and equal opportunity. So what brought me to this area was, personally, in the beginning, I happened to be a 1L at the University of Texas when the 9/11 attacks happened.
Oh, wow.
And that ultimately, caused me to work for the ACLU and then to do pro bono work on behalf of many of these Muslim groups, ultimately becoming also a civil rights litigator. And I was fortunate to transition then my interest and expertise and advocacy experience into the academy, where I now write on issues at the intersection of national security and civil rights, with a particular focus on the disproportionate adverse impacts on Muslims, Arab, and South Asian communities in the United States. And then related to that, I also research on geopolitics between the Middle East and the United States, and counterterrorism, authoritarianism, and the rule of law, because as we see in the Muslim ban case, what happens abroad is frequently used to justify discrimination domestically against these communities. So you can't really understand what happens here without understanding that relationship with what happens in the Middle East and the U.S.'s foreign policy in that region. So that's what I do in a nutshell. And so the Hawaii v. Trump case was certainly squarely within my wheelhouse.
Well, and we're going to get into the details of the case so that we can explore some of the ways in which it illuminates the experience for Muslim Americans and the issues you've raised so far. But it's so much bigger than that, and it is already so much broader than that. I mean, much more recently, even than the Muslim ban, this travel ban that the president was so committed to as a priority in his agenda. It was the first big issue he took on after taking office. But using these issues and the way his rhetoric and the way he talks about these issues in the politics of our time, we've seen it even more recently in the way in which, in the lead up to the midterm elections that we just had in this country, the president talking about this caravan of migrants making their way across Mexico from Central America, as he put it, probably had some Middle East terrorists among their numbers. Something that was never proven, and there was no evidence to support, but nonetheless probably touched on some important nerves in some of the people he was trying to appeal to. So it's something that we've seen very recently in the big stage of politics in this country.
Absolutely, it's very acceptable until now to hold explicitly anti-Muslim views, at least in terms of associating Islam and Middle Easterners with terrorism, in ways that if you did that to other religious communities would be quickly condemned as anti-Semitic, anti-Christian, anti-religion, or particularly anti-religious freedom, and outright racist. And I think that's the challenge of our time among, there are some other key civil rights issues, for example, those experienced by the LGBT community. But I think anti-Muslim bias, what some people call Islamophobia, is today similar to anti-Semitism in the early 1900s when it was accepted, or anti-Irish prejudice, which also had anti-Catholicism kind of embedded in that, where an anti-Japanese also bias, where it was open, it was explicit. We look back on it in repulsion, but we have to acknowledge that that was considered normal. And the question and the challenge for us today, especially those of us who prioritize civil rights as a fundamental American value, is are we repeating the mistakes of the past? And if we are, have we evolved as a society in terms of our commitment to pluralism and equality?
Well, and you're right that 9/11 and the attacks of 9/11 have to have changed things because, Europe has experienced war. The Middle East has experienced war. Asia has experienced war. But our country, though we've been involved in war, never really experienced an attack on our people, on our country, on our soil. Until then, we had a big civil war in this country, but we didn't, it's been a lot of years since the United States was attacked in that way. And so that is recent enough in our time that people have still very fresh and deep and emotional responses to the way they think about it. And I think one of the things that already you're helping us focus on is the fact that probably very few people think about the way a Muslim American experienced that event and what that's meant in the way we all get used to the rhetoric, the war on terror, and all the ways that our politicians and leaders have talked about it, but probably very few of us have thought about that experience from the Muslim American perspective.
I agree with you. I just want to make one comment, is that unfortunately, many of us in the beginning thought, who've been working on these issues, thought it was merely a backlash, that it was this kind of instinctive, visceral response to this horrendous attack on, quote unquote, the homeland, and that it would last a year or two maximum, and then Americans would realize that being, collectively punishing and suspecting millions of people simply by virtue of their religious faith was un-American. However, one, that's proven not to be the case from an evidentiary perspective. But also, we do need to acknowledge that, anti-Japanese bias and that led to internment. Yes, that was based on the attacks, the Pearl Harbor attacks, but we didn't have a war, in the United States. Similarly, the anti-Chinese exclusion, the anti-Semitism, the anti-Irish biases, anti-Black racism, it wasn't connected to being attacked and going to war on our own soil. So I just want us to be careful in not attributing it to a particular event that was very traumatic, but cause us as Americans to be more introspective and ask ourselves, can we overcome our historical sins, for lack of a better word, whether it's slavery or the conquering and near annihilation of Native Americans, xenophobia, etc., which is as much a part of this country's history as social mobility, economic opportunity, equal attempts for equal opportunity, and the economic and political reasons that have caused tens of millions, actually hundreds of millions of people to immigrate here from across the world, and they continue to do so. So America has many attractions, but I think the 9/11 attacks and the aftermath are an opportunity for us to look at our history and really try to not repeat it, and understand that within the history there are we have a very checkered past with regard to how we treat minorities.
Well, and that case of the Japanese internments, really concentration camps for Japanese Americans in this country after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, is actually mentioned and discussed a bit in the Muslim ban, the travel ban opinion, which we're going to talk about next. So it's definitely something that was on the mind of the Supreme Court justices on both sides, the majority and the dissenting justices. The rhetoric of of discrimination, the rhetoric of anti-Muslim views, prejudice, fear, hatred among some, also then gets wrapped up in the immigration issue more broadly. And Donald Trump really exploited that very, very heavily during the presidential campaign and has continued to really with his words since becoming president. Can you give us the setup for this dispute? It's complicated, and we'd probably need 3 hours to go through every detail of it. But I want to try to get enough introduced about the issue so that we can understand how the Supreme Court resolved this eventually, and then try to understand what its impact has been. But if you could give us a bit of a summary of it, that would be helpful.
Well, President Trump strategically and purposely issued an executive order, I believe it was within a week of when he was inaugurated, 1 or 2 weeks, at the end of January, that we now call the Muslim ban, and now I can explain more why it's called the Muslim ban as opposed to the facially neutral travel ban title, wherein he prohibited the entry of any non-U.S. citizen who originated from 7 countries. So you had Libya, Iraq, Iran, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. Mm-hmm. And as we saw in the news, it created havoc because as soon as it was issued, hundreds of thousands of people who were coming from all of these different countries, some of whom who didn't live in those countries, but their passports were from those countries. So they could be coming from Europe or from other parts of the world, but their nationality was of these countries. And suddenly they were in transit, or they were about to leave, or they had just arrived in the United States, and suddenly they were denied entry into the country and detained in airports across the country, which created havoc from a travel perspective, but also harm to their families and harm to them and much anxiety. And we saw the quite impressive array of protests that occurred across the country by many Americans of various races, ethnicities, and religions, not just Muslims or those who have some ties to these countries, right, who were protesting not only the content, but the means in which he did it. It was sudden. It was without any review by his cabinet, any study by national security officials. It was this unilateral executive decision that came out just a few days after he took office, and it had been something that clearly he and Steve Bannon had planned. And Steve Bannon is known, he's infamous, he doesn't hide it, that he is a far-right extremist who is openly Islamophobic and suspects all Muslims of terrorism, and has explicitly stated he wants to stop and halt all immigration or entry of people of the Muslim faith. And Steve Bannon, as we know, is one of Trump's top advisors in the White House, in the first few months of his administration.
Right.
So that was the first executive order, and as expected, a slew of litigation arose, and the various courts, with the exception, I believe, of a district court in Boston and one perhaps, I believe, in Virginia, but every other court issued a stay on the executive order because they believe, based on the expectation that the plaintiffs would win on the merits once they were able to get further into the litigation. That caused Trump to then issue a second executive order where he took Iraq off of the list, and he changed a few minor things, But again, that was subjected to litigation. And that went up to the Ninth Circuit and the Fourth Circuit, where both circuits, again, affirmed the stays and found that the plaintiffs would win on the merits once it got to that stage in the litigation. And so finally then, Trump issues a third one, which is the one that is before the Supreme Court in 2017. And what's notable about this one, at least from the government's perspective, each time he's trying to remedy the basis for challenging the executive order. And the primary basis is, one, this is not based on national security grounds. This is driven by anti-Muslim animus, which is unconstitutional.
Under the First
Amendment. Violation of the Establishment Clause. It's also a violation of the INA, the Immigration Nationality Act, in particular the non-discrimination clauses in terms of how visas are issued. And his claim that he's authorized to do so based on Section 1182F of the INA that allows the president to engage in immigration enforcement if he can show that there is a detriment to U.S. national interest,
right?
Which is very broad and very vague. And so that's what brought us to Executive Order number 3, which is before before the Supreme Court.
So let me just back up to clarify a couple of things. First of all, I want to understand what these what these bans really were getting at and what they weren't getting at, because I think there's some confusion about this. First of all, this had nothing to do, at least directly, with refugees, right? That's a whole separate set of issues, whether what basis the president might have for limiting the number of refugees or how asylum seekers, how those claims get handled. This was really a limit or a ban and then a limit on people seeking a visa to come to this country on some basis or another. It might be a temporary work visa, it might be a student visa, it might be a visa to come to this country with the intent actually to immigrate here and one day become a citizen, but a whole range of visas rather than refugee or asylum seekers. Is that right?
Well, the first version barred all refugees from Syria and then created an exception for those who were claiming religious discrimination, and that was effectively code for Christian Syrians.
Yeah, that's right. Okay.
Trump had made comments clarifying that that's what he meant by making a religious discrimination or religious persecution exemption for for Syrian refugees. And now, one thing the government emphasized, these were only temporary bans. It was 90 days until they could do a review. But they had done no due diligence. They hadn't even told the Department of Homeland Security, the White House, and Trump and his advisors that they were issuing this executive order. So the executive branch got caught flat-footed. Many of the agencies were blindsided.
Right.
So the original one, yes, did include Syrian refugees. And then later he removed the exemption because that was a blatant violation of the Establishment Clause. But ultimately, there is still a limitation on the refugee entry, particularly from Syria.
Right. So as he goes through the different versions of this plan, he's trying to deal with the things that are going to really cause it to run into direct conflict with the First Amendment, with the established. So in the first version, the one that came out just after he becomes president, he's essentially got an exception for Christians from Syria. So Muslims from Syria stay out, but Christians, you can come in. And that's just seen as so blatantly a violation of the First Amendment that had to go. And until you get to this final version, and I guess that's then the question, right, that the Supreme Court has to wrestle with, because in addition to some of the more overt provisions in the first version of this, you also have all of the president's statements about what this was going to be. He really made no secret of that when he was on the campaign trail. He said, I'm going to ban Muslims. I'm going to make sure no Muslims come to this country when I'm president. And then when he does come out with this initial executive order, at least in the popular understanding of it, it's kind of hard not to see it as anything other than what he said it would be. And that poses some real problems for the court when it has to get down to the business of analyzing exactly what it is the Supreme Court is being confronted with. So how does the court handle that then?
So the dissent from Sotomayor, and she was joined by Ginsburg, is the most stinging dissent. So there's two sets of dissents. One's by Breyer and Kagan, and the other one's by Sotomayor and Ginsburg. And Sotomayor, I think, does a good job of putting the record, or setting the record straight, saying, here is what the president said in the 2 years directly leading up to the first executive order. And remember, each executive order is related to the previous one, so it's a bit disingenuous for Trump to pretend as if the third executive order should be looked at independently, separately from the first one, which the evidence shows is the one that most accurately expresses what the White House's motivation was, notwithstanding the various ways that his administration tried to remedy the infected animus behind the first order. And so I'll just read something from Sotomayor's decision or dissent. Quote, in January 2016, during a Republican primary debate, Trump was asked whether he wanted to rethink his position on banning Muslims from entering the country. He answered no. A month later, at a rally in South Carolina, Trump told a powerful story about United States General John J. Pershing killing a large group of Muslim insurgents in the Philippines with bullets dipped in pig's blood in the early 1900s. In March 2016, he expressed his belief that Islam hates us. We can't allow people coming into this country of this hatred of the United States and of people that are not Muslim. That same month, Trump asserted that we're having problems with the Muslims and we're having problems with Muslims coming into this country. He therefore called for the surveillance of mosques in the United States, blaming terrorist attacks on Muslims' lack of assimilation and their commitment to Sharia law. And a day later, he opined that Muslims do not respect us at all and don't respect a lot of the things that are happening throughout not only our country, but they don't respect other things. So that's a direct quote from the Sotomayor dissenting decision, and she goes on, essentially just quoting Trump.
Right, and there's so much more even than that. I mean, I read that part too, and not only those and many other statements he made, he actually invoked at one point in a speech the decision by President Roosevelt to inter Japanese Americans. He actually invoked that as precedent, one of the most reviled moments in our country's history, one of the most reviled Supreme Court decisions, too, that upheld FDR's interring of Japanese Americans. He actually invoked that in support of what he was doing. So there's a huge record of Trump doing this. But I guess the question is, and the question was answered by the majority under Chief Justice Roberts, that you can look at what the law is and separate it from the intention of the lawmaker or of the creator of this law, or the motivator, instigator of this law, in this case the president. And I mean, I would assume that you take issue with that you cannot do that you cannot separate the intention from these other bases for these restrictions.
What the court did, Roberts wrote the decision, and it was a 5-4 decision. And actually, there was a concurring opinion by Thomas and one, I believe, by Stevens. But what he did is, interestingly, he acknowledged that in this case, quote unquote, extrinsic evidence can be looked at to determine what the intent behind the third executive ban is. But that extrinsic evidence does not suffice to overcome the rational basis test. So he applies the rational basis test, which many of us legal scholars and lawyers know usually means that the government's claim is going to succeed or their position is going to be successful, and argues that whatever it is that Trump said was in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And that what we should be looking at is what he did in the 50 days prior to the third executive order. And what his administration did is effectively go through this process, which was clearly not a genuine process. It was just remedial because they had been sued and they'd lost their cases in the Ninth and the Fourth Circuit for challenging the stay of the executive order. And they went through the kind of a script of checking to see if all of these countries have followed all the proper vetting procedures and whether they, in fact, checked all the boxes that the United States required for them in terms of making sure that they weren't associated with terrorists and that they wouldn't be a danger to the United States if they entered. The problem with that argument is that it happened right before the executive order, number 3. It didn't happen, for example, before executive order number 1.
Mm-hmm.
There were many inconsistencies. For example, Somalia, which the government admitted, had the most stringent form of passport control to ensure there was no fraud, to ensure that people couldn't kind of fall through the cracks, and yet Somalia was included because they claimed there's a conflict in that region. And of course, if we were to accept that policy, that means anytime there's a war, we shouldn't let anyone in, which has some has a catastrophic humanitarian impact on refugees and even just lawful immigrants and non-immigrant visas. So what we saw is that the court kind of acknowledged what Trump said, but didn't take it seriously insofar as reversing or striking down the executive order or affirming the stay.
Right. It seems like because the court, in looking at the law that gives the president the right to regulate immigration if it involves, I'm really reducing it down to the most simplest terms, but if the president can justify a limit on immigration for national security reasons and can articulate a basis, that's the rational basis test you were referring to earlier. As long as the government comes up with any reasonable rational basis, the court is going to give deference to that. It's going to give deference to the executive authority under that law. I mean, Congress could always come along and pass a different law if they could get together and agree on anything. They could always come along and pass a new law, but the law as invoked and as written, the courts in this case deferring to the administration, which comes up with some kind of basis. You know, they say, well, these are countries that are state sponsors of terrorism. These are countries that include, this is in the final version of this, non-Muslim countries. North Korea is on the list. Venezuela is on the list. So those countries are included, and that support, at least on its face, supports an argument that this isn't an entirely anti-Muslim policy. And they say these are countries that can't give us assurances of being able to identify that a certain person is who their passport says they are, and we've offered them an opportunity to improve their measures, and they haven't. I mean, those are the justifications for the policy on the one hand, and the court just seems to say, I'm going to defer to that executive authority given those reasons, and I'm going to ignore all of what is out there about what the president said this was going to be.
Correct. And to be fair to the majority, but for the large record of anti-Muslim animus that Trump has produced and created, a case involving national security and immigration is precisely the type of case that gets the highest level of judicial deference to the executive. And in that regard, the reasoning isn't unusual. It's the application of the reasoning and the I think incorrect interpretation of the record that shows that I think even from a rational basis test, it would fail, because Trump has created such a large record. He doesn't hide his bias. And one thing I wanted to highlight is, the government usually will cite a case called Clandestine v. Vandel, which involved a Belgian journalist and self-described revolutionary Marxist who had been invited to speak at a conference at Stanford, and this was back in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And the government denied his visas and denied his entry, and there was a First Amendment challenge of that denial. And the court in that case, which is kind of the seminal case that cited, I think it was in the 70s, that says the judiciary does not have the authority to look behind the motive of an executive act, so long as the executive gives a facially legitimate and bona fide reason for its action. And so in that regard, that case in particular has caused many plaintiffs who challenge executive action in the national security realm or in the foreign affairs realm to lose. So what's, I think, interesting about the majority opinion is that Roberts actually acknowledged that Mandel doesn't apply here because the facially legitimate and bona fide reason of the Trump administration was not, in fact, that. And because the record was so strong that he held animus. But then he turned around and dismissed that evidence and weighing it against what happened only in the last 50 days before the third executive order was issued, saying this shows, that in fact there is a rational basis. They're really just trying to prevent terrorists from entering the country. This is just a travel ban aimed at preserving national security. And so if we weigh the last 2.5 years over the last 60 days or 50 days, we think what happened most recently is the true motivation behind the executive order, and as a result, this is not a violation of the Establishment Clause, nor is it an unauthorized invocation of 1182F in terms of saying this is the executive's claim that allowing these individuals in or people from these countries in would be a detriment to the United States. And also, the majority distinguished, which I think many immigration lawyers took issue with, is distinguished between entry and visa issuance, because 1152A1A of the Immigration Nationality Act prohibits non-discrimination in the issuance of immigration visas. So it doesn't apply to non-immigrant visas, but it does apply to immigrant visas. And so the argument from the plaintiffs was, well, by denying these people entry categorically, right, and they're all from Muslim majority countries, and we already know that you try to exempt Christians, at least with refugees, that you are discriminating based on religion, based on race, based on unlawful grounds. And the majority opinion said, no, there's a difference between entry or admissibility and issuance of visas. But of course, the two go hand in hand. So there were a lot of flaws in the reasoning. It seemed like a predetermined outcome. I think that Roberts, the majority, was trying to find any way it could to follow in the tradition of giving judicial deference to the executive when it comes to national security and immigration. And I think ultimately that's going to be the long-lasting impact of this case, is that now presidents can be as racist, as phobic, against a particular religion or a particular race as they want in their rhetoric and even in their practices, as long as they just go through the motions and have some alternative pretextual explanation that's based on national security or immigration enforcement grounds, and everybody can wink, wink, nod, nod, and play along. And ultimately, this undermines the rule of law in the United States, and it undermines the legitimacy of the executive branch and even the judiciary branch.
Well, that's what I was wondering, and then we have to broaden out from just the circumstances of this case for a few minutes, but if we can imagine, and this is asking a lot of our imaginations, I know, but if we could imagine this same set of circumstances, but without all of the many statements the president made before he became president and since. Because, there are a lot of people out there who may say, I like what Trump's doing, I just don't like what he's saying. And they find ways to, look past some of the dumber or more offensive things that he says, depending. Can we imagine a situation where if we remove from the record and from all of our memories the things that he said and just looked at this last iteration of this effort to deal with these issues of people coming from countries, not only Iran and Syria and Yemen, but places like North Korea and other places, would there have been an issue here? I mean, would there have still been the sense that this was anti-Muslim when, and I found this fascinating, the presidents on 43 prior occasions, 43 times before this, had, for one reason or another, issued some type of immigrant restrictions, even going so far as to identify an entire country's population, in the case of Cuba during Reagan's presidency and Iran during the presidency of Jimmy Carter. So if we could take away this rhetoric and these statements, how would you look at this differently, or would you look at this the same way, I guess?
I think with regard, so if you look at the countries, it's Yemen, Venezuela, Chad, Iran, Iraq, Libya, North Korea, Syria. He then later removed, the Trump administration removed Chad, and Iraq was also removed, including Somalia is also on there, and Sudan was originally on there, and they got removed. So Venezuela and North Korea are clearly red herrings, and they are used to distract from the ultimate concern that this is about Muslim majority.
Why do you say that? Is that because we don't get a lot of immigration from those two countries? Or?
Right. With North Korea, the North Korean government doesn't allow anyone to leave.
Yeah,
so
okay.
It's a moot issue. It's a non-starter. With Venezuela, the restrictions were only limited to the government, high-level government officials and diplomats and their families on certain types of immigration visas. So it was a very, very tiny number of people or pool of people, and clearly, again, was just used as a means to add to the list to say, oh, look, we've got two countries that are not Muslim majority.
Okay.
And with regard to the other countries, there had been some studies that were done by immigrant advocates and those and other, they're in the amicus briefs, showing that none of these countries had individuals, or there was a record to show that individuals from these countries had actually committed terrorist attacks on U.S. soil. And so even if you looked at the cases, the prosecutions, and the record of anti-terrorism and counterterrorism investigations and prosecutions that were public, that there was, with the exception, there was no one who was a foreigner who had committed terrorist acts on the U.S. The few who may have had origins from those countries were actually American citizens or long-time permanent residents who had been living here for a very long time and had never gone back to their nation of origin. So there were no facts to show that there was really a threat. The only other basis that could be justifiable and is more consistent with what you saw with Carter and with Reagan is if you were to focus, perhaps, for example, on countries like Iran, because that is where you have a country that the administration has declared, especially this administration, Trump administration, as kind of an enemy of the United States. And so when you have these foreign affairs disputes or foreign relations disputes, that tends to be more consistently a basis for kind of collectively punishing all their citizens, and it has been done in the past. That doesn't mean that I necessarily agree with it or others agree with it, but there's at least a precedent for that. But many of these other countries like Yemen, Libya, Syria, we actually are involved in those conflicts. I mean, we funded many of the militias through the proxy war in Syria. And so I think it's a little ironic, if not outright hypocritical, for us as a country to contribute to the violence that produces the refugees and the migrants, the crisis, and then say, well, you're not allowed to come in simply by virtue of your nationality, not an individualized assessment for these individuals of you, in fact, we have evidence that you are, in fact, associated with terrorism or that you are a national security threat. So I think it's a really hard case to make on national security grounds, with the exception of perhaps Iran because of the foreign relations. And the only reason there aren't more countries on here is for two reasons. One is the mitigation or the limitation on Trump's anti-Muslim animus is his avarice for making money from Middle East regimes.
Yeah.
And so he couldn't put Saudi Arabia on because he just sold them $10 billion in U.S. military equipment. And he can't put Egypt on because he needs the Egyptians to assist with security and to work with the Israelis.
Right.
And there's a lot of military arms trade. But I think if Bannon in particular was left to his own devices, and Trump, I think, would go along if there wasn't a cost to it from a military sales perspective, I think he would add as many Muslim majority countries as he could. So it's really only kind of geopolitics and realpolitik that constrain Trump, as opposed to bona fide national security threats.
Well, and we've really gone into some detail about this particular initiative, this immigration ban. But the rhetoric, I asked, is it possible to put aside or imagine a world without the rhetoric? And of course you can't, because the rhetoric is out there, and he isn't just talking about Muslims from these countries when he's talking in front of big crowds and political rallies, and he's not just talking about Islam as practiced by this person or that person. He's making much more sweeping rhetorical statements about Islam and about Muslims. So, I mean, you've talked about, you brought up the word racialization of Muslims and Islamophobia. Beyond this particular court case, and this, what are some of the ways that you're seeing that being expressed today in other settings?
So in my forthcoming book, which is tentatively titled "The Muslim Menace: the racialization of the religion in the post-9/11 era," I talk about the way in which a religious identity, specifically Muslim identity, has become treated like a race rather than a religion. And the reason I think that's important is because in law and in society, American society, we believe that we privilege religious freedom and religious rights in contrast to our history of racial discrimination, and some Americans believe that we are now post-racial and that in fact racism is an anomaly and it's something that is fringe. And so we tend to be more accepting of racial discrimination than we are of religious persecution, so I'm kind of challenging both in saying, no, actually, we still do have a racism problem. And in many ways, Trump has exposed that, because you are correct that his rhetoric is not just Islamophobic, it's also xenophobic and anti-immigrant, which tends to have a anti-Latino and anti-Hispanic implications. And he's also made many statements that I think are clearly anti-Black and anti-African American. So Muslims now, instead of being treated like a religious minority that warrant protection and that are supposed to be shielded from persecution, they're pushed into being a race. And once they're pushed into being a race, it's almost as if they're fair game for discrimination, because that's what we've done all along, and as a society and as a country. And I think that's one of the reasons why people who self-identify, leaders and members of the public who self-identify as devout Christians or devout in their particular faith, and are strong believers in religious freedom don't see a contradiction between those beliefs and their anti-Muslim beliefs. Because once you racialize Muslims, what you do in how it manifests itself is they are now terrorists. Right? They're violent. They're a threat to society. Their religion, their so-called religion, Islam, becomes recast and reframed as a violent political ideology. So if you can take Islam out of the realm of religion and take Muslims out of the realm of a religious minority and put them into a political ideology, and which then treats them as a race, then you can be as anti-Muslim and Islamophobic as you want, and it's not anti-American. Quite the opposite. It's patriotic.
Right.
It's rational.
Or you fuzz, you make it all fuzzy so that you don't know, which also serves to increase people's fear. If you knew which were the radicals and which were the terrorists and which were the ones really out to do you harm, it wouldn't be such a big problem. But by creating a sense that we don't know, what you're also doing in that is making people afraid of all of the other, whoever the other is, all Muslims, because we just don't know.
Well, it's this presumption of guilt, right, as opposed to a presumption of innocence.
Right.
And that is the difference between experiencing that minority status versus the majority status with the privileges that you are presumed to be innocent and that every individual is responsible for their own actions, as opposed to each individual is responsible for all the actions of the group that they may self-identify, whether be imputed as their identity, whether it's Sikhs or Hindus or even Latinos who are mistaken for being Muslim, because anyone who quote-unquote looks Arab is assumed to be Muslim, which is false. In fact, I believe the numbers are something around 60% of Arabs in the United States are actually Christian. So the majority of Arabs are Christian.
Right.
So, yeah, there are some very broad implications. Now, how does that then manifest itself? There are some areas where we see it, kind of the most egregious manifestations. One is in the employment realm. And some of it is provable, some of it is not, but we do see quite a bit of discrimination in employment based on people's either actual or presumed identity or association with Islam and Muslim identity. So there could be a hostile work environment where those stereotypes are then reiterated through rhetoric and through action. It could be through failure to promote, being fired, or not even being hired in the first place, which is very difficult to prove. We also see it in school bullying, which has been quite under-researched, but we hear it anecdotally, those of us who work with these communities, that children are being bullied at alarming rates, Muslim children, both by their peers and even by their teachers. And there's a lot of ignorance and insensitivity about what happens, for example, abroad, and the way that it is taught, such that the students, the idea that Islam and Muslims and Arabs are inherently violent is then reinforced in the curriculum. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of training teachers in how they talk about that region and the religion and just anything that relates to Muslims, Arabs, South Asians in general, but also in ensuring that any anti-bullying efforts include, with a purpose, anti-Muslim bullying, because that has become its own form of bullying. We also see hate crimes are a serious problem. They tend to be worse. They kind of goes up and down. I mean, it's hard to know the numbers because of reporting. Oftentimes, those who are most vulnerable to being subjected to hate crimes are the least likely to report because they're part of vulnerable communities, whether they're immigrants or whether they're minorities who don't think the police will believe them, or they don't trust the police because they see them as people who also perpetuate those stereotypes. But we see women who wear headscarves being attacked, especially if there is a high-profile terrorist attack that happens in a Western country, whether it's in Europe or in the United States. But we do see the reporting goes up there. And we also see it in mosques. So we have mosques experiencing vandalizations across the country. And again, it tends to peak, or at least the reporting peaks, when there is a high-profile terrorist incident. And also we see zoning rules being changed or interpreted in ways to deny mosques from being built or from expanding based on pretextual purposes, that there'll be traffic, that there'll be noise, and sometimes more explicitly that we don't want terrorists in our midst because we believe that mosques are terrorist factories. And so there's a lot of work to be done at the grassroots level that I think public policymakers at the local, at the city level, the state level, could focus on to ensure that their communities are less prejudiced, because these are things that we don't necessarily know about unless we hear the voices of those most directly impacted. And again, when you're dealing with 6 to 8 million people in a country of over 330 million, they're a tiny, tiny minority, and they are disproportionately discriminated against based on their numbers and disproportionately covered in the news through that terrorist lens, but then disproportionately underserved in terms of dealing with discrimination and hate crimes.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. In all of these areas, we've talked about hate crimes on this podcast before, and we're not going to ever eliminate hatred. We're never going to eliminate people who are inclined to think these thoughts and post these ideas on social media, and even in some cases commit acts of heinous violence. We saw this in the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, and a general rise in hate crimes, at least those reported, as you point out. Most of those against Muslims in our country and Jews in our country to this day. So it's the answer at least has to be hearing those voices. Not that this erases all of the problems or makes it all better, but having two newly elected members of the House of Representatives who are Muslim Americans, maybe that at least creates some way in which some voices will get heard more prominently on some of these issues in the coming months and years. I don't know, but certainly. Yeah, go ahead, please.
No, I think that the silver lining in the last 18 years is that the new generation of Muslim Americans, most of whom, or increasing number of whom, were born here or at least raised nearly all their life here, are being very American and fighting back. Rather than kind of sitting in the corner and whining or trying to stand the radar, many of those who came of age after 9/11, who belong to these communities, have used the oppression as a motivator to get more engaged in civic life and political life. And I think that is the good news. And they went to the airports and they protested and they were named plaintiffs in lawsuits.
And ran for Congress.
And ran for Congress and won, right? As opposed to their parents who had been raised abroad, who admittedly, many of them, not all of them, kind of tried to stay below the radar and thought that it would pass. And the new generation realized, no, that's not what I was raised to believe in school. So the American public education system is doing something right in that regard, in terms of teaching us what our ideals are. I think we just have an obligation as citizens to act on those ideals and not just read them and believe them in the abstract. Because if there's one thing we've learned under this current administration, but even in the last 18 years in what I study, is that democracy, it doesn't just exist by itself. The people have to every day engage in that act. Equality isn't a guarantee. Freedom isn't a guarantee. Non-discrimination isn't a guarantee. And if it's simply, we know this as lawyers, just because it's on paper, just because it's in the books, doesn't mean it's in practice. And it's really up to us, whether as lawyers or non-lawyers, to be the change we seek in making the society that we want to create, notwithstanding our checkered history, right? Notwithstanding the history of white supremacy or slavery or all of the systemic racism and oppression that we've experienced, and many other nations have experienced in different ways. But I think we don't have to let that bind us or bind our future.
Well, and one of the voices we need to hear is yours, Professor Sahar Aziz, and I'm so grateful that you shared it with us today on Good Law, Bad Law. It's been a great conversation and an important one. And I appreciate your time and all of your thoughts and views on these subjects very, very much. So thank you very much for being on our podcast. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for inviting me.